Okay.
There we go. All right. So Gord, you've had some significant experiences interacting with other cultures, and you've got experience with worship in different languages. What places and languages have you had significant worship interaction with?
Well, like most people in Canada, I grew up in the high school system. The junior high school system required when I was a kid to speak French. So I spent grade 7 to grade 12 speaking French. Well, learning French. I wasn't very good at it, and I didn't really try very hard at it. My first real language immersion thing was when in medical school, I took a 3-month independent study in Haiti, working in a hospital down there, and they speak Creole down there, Haitian Creole. And that was my first real attempt at speaking in another language that I had to learn really fast in order to communicate with the patients that we had there in that hospital. And so, but I never had any worship experience in that language, because in the hospital, everybody was American and Canadian. So we all spoke English to each other. And the worship time we had was always in English. Then we went to Quebec for immersion French when we were preparing to go over to Africa in Zaire, which was a French-speaking country. So we spent a year in Quebec, and we intentionally joined a French-speaking church there, and that was a real experience. We studied every day at Laval University in their immersion program, and then went to church on Sundays and tried to understand what on earth was happening in the service. By the end of the 8 months that we were there, we started to get it, but it's really hard understanding, particularly scriptural French, because it's not sort of everyday language in many ways. So it was difficult there. We went to Antwerp right after that, and I had to do some tropical medicine studies there. So we thought we would get exposed to some Flemish, which is what they speak there mostly. But because we didn't need to learn it, I didn't want to go to church in it. So we just went to an English-speaking church that was run for missionaries in the evenings, on Sunday evenings. So we went to an English-speaking church. So I heard Flemish in and around me sometimes, but I didn't really make any effort to learn it or to understand it. And then when we got to Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we had to learn Kiswahili, and we use French to some degree, but almost entirely I spent my time in Swahili, speaking with the patients and with the staff. The staff, sometimes we would switch back and forth in French because we used a lot of medical jargon, which was French. But the Swahili was almost entirely with the patients, because they couldn't, most of the poorer people in Zaire at the time couldn't speak French. So I spent a lot of time in Swahili, and the church services were held in Swahili, and that was a real struggle for us, because it's a different culture and a different language, and we struggled to understand it. Even after 2 years, it was because they speak very fast, and even though if I could speak it slowly, I couldn't understand the rapidity at which they spoke. It was just really difficult. So, and I'm not a great linguist anyway. That was not one of my gifts, I guess, but I think that's pretty well it, up until we went to Cuba.
Well, that sounds further ahead than me, language-wise. I took French every year at school, from what we call grade primary through to grade 12, and it didn't stick very well. So,
Yeah.
but part of that's practice too, right?
Yeah.
So when you did worship in other languages like Swahili or French, I guess what was challenging about that, and what kind of things did it make you realize within that?
Well, I think the first thing that I thought that really made me struggle was the idea that not being able to communicate with other people was really difficult, and it made me feel kind of inferior somehow. Like walking down the street in Quebec, little children would come up to you and ask you a question. A 5-year-old kid would ask you a question. You had no idea what they said to you, because they had their childish way of speaking too. And so it wasn't the way we were being taught in the university. And I just didn't understand a word they said. And they would look at you like you're an idiot. Like, I'm a little boy, and I still can't understand this adult who's trying to talk to me, and he can't understand. It was very humiliating to not be able to speak. And praying, I think one of the biggest barriers I found was praying in another language. Praying uses a different mentality, a different group. You're asking, a lot of times you're asking God for help or for anything, and this is the questioning way that we speak in prayer was hard for me to learn in Swahili and in French. So it was very awkward trying to pray. I used to try and memorize prayers that I could say if I was ever called on to pray, and it was really a struggle to do that. Praying, I think, was a real problem for me in French. That's one of the big memories I had of how uncomfortable it got when somebody asked me to pray. It's like, oh no, now I was bad at the language, but now I'm really bad at it because I couldn't pray well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind with that is that a lot of times, we have people that come from other countries that speak different languages, and English is not their first language, and we expect them to come and worship in English with us like it's no big deal, and it's different. So yeah.
It really is.
So you had those experiences several years ago. More recently, you had an experience with other languages on a short-term mission to Cuba, and maybe share a bit about what kind of things struck you, or what kind of things you were reflecting on as you were immersed in that experience.
Well, we went in 2019, just before the pandemic hit, and at first it wasn't too strange. It had been a long time, like it had been 30 years since I'd been in another cultural language for any length of time. And we had sort of tried to do a very simplistic, 2 or 3 week prep course on the things you can say in Spanish. And it never sort of occurred to me that there was going to be a lot more to it than that. I mean, being with everybody in our group that could speak English already. But once we got there and everybody was speaking Spanish, it was, again, this overwhelming feeling of inferiority and sort of, oh man, I feel like a child here again. It was such a, there is humiliation in that. I can't sound intelligent because I can't say what I want to say, and that was really tough for me. But I remember sitting in one of the worship services during the big the community convention that they had, the Baptist convention they had, and I remember sitting there, and suddenly it just dawned on me that God speaks Spanish. Like I recognized that he can speak Swahili and he can speak English and French, and then suddenly it just got bigger for me somehow. Like all of a sudden I realized, like, he's a polyglot. He can speak any language. And I never sort of put that into my head in that way before. And then so with the idea of praying, like, because when I pray, I don't speak out loud. I just pray to God in my thoughts. And he understands my thoughts. He reads my thoughts. Maybe he doesn't even hear my language. He just hears my thoughts. I don't know how that works with God, but the idea that language, it says suddenly realize that God and language are kind of different. He reads, he knows me, understands me without my language. There's something else in me that communicates with him, but to communicate with each other and in all these other languages I mean, Jesus must have spoken Aramaic and Greek and who knows what else he spoke, Phoenician and all sorts of languages. Like I don't know what he spoke, but he was clearly understandable in whatever he spoke. And I just, it boggles my mind to think that he understands us wherever we are, whatever we're thinking. He knows that. And it was a real revelation to me, the idea that we are understood whether we're speaking or not, but whether we're speaking in any particular language, he gets what we're saying.
Yeah, we guess we always work in this language of like translation, where we think, well, we got to put this in a language so someone else can understand it. And yet God is already right there. Like God is already speaking the language, as it were. So it's an amazing thing to consider.
It was really interesting to think through that and process it.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I'm going to stop it right here. That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.